Deep in the Cascade Mountains, where morning mist dances through ancient pines, a young man named Kyle tends to his simple life with only his faithful dog, River, for company. Abandoned as a child and raised by the mountain itself, he knows every hidden trail, every secret grove, every creature that calls this wilderness home. For 20 years, he has lived in perfect harmony with nature, believing himself to be the valley's sole human inhabitant. What Kyle doesn't know is that his mountain paradise sits atop something extraordinary, a mystical spring that grants eternal youth to all who drink from its waters. The ancient spirits that have protected this sacred place for centuries chose him as their guardian long ago, though he remains unaware of his true purpose. But when a team of outsiders arrives with heavy machinery and dangerous intentions, everything changes. What will happen when the boy who was raised by the wild must choose between his peaceful existence and protecting the ancient magic that flows through his very soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the valley in shades of gold and amber as Kale emerged from his shelter, a simple but sturdy structure built into the natural curve of a massive boulder. The carved walking stick in his hand caught the early sunlight, its intricate pattern seeming to shift and dance in the morning glow. He'd found the staff years ago, half buried near a circle of ancient stones, and though he couldn't decipher the symbols etched deep into its surface, it had become as essential to his daily routine as breathing itself. River stretched beside him, the dog's thick coat shimmering with dewdrops. The animal's eyes held an intelligence that went beyond mere canine instinct, watching Kale with an awareness that seemed almost human. Together they moved through their morning ritual with the practiced ease of two beings who had shared countless dawns. The valley spread before them like a living tapestry. Towering Douglas firs reached toward the sky, their branches heavy with the night's moisture. Below, a carpet of ferns and moss created a soft green foundation that muffled their footsteps. The air carried the clean scent of pine needles and rich earth, mixed with the distant fragrance of wildflowers that bloomed in hidden meadows. Kyle's bare feet found purchase on the familiar stones as he descended toward the stream that wound through the heart of his domain. The carved stick served as both support and companion, its smooth surface worn by countless journeys through this wilderness. He paused at a bend in the water where smooth stones created a natural basin, perfect for catching the mountain trout that provided much of his sustenance. With movements refined by years of practice, Kyle constructed a simple fish trap from willow branches and river stones. River sat nearby, alert but patient, understanding his role in their partnership. The dog would remain motionless until the moment came to drive the fish toward Kyle's waiting hands. As they worked, memories flickered through Kyle's mind like fragments of half-remembered dreams. He recalled winter nights huddled against River's warmth, the dog somehow always knowing exactly how much heat to provide. He remembered summer afternoons, learning which berries were safe to eat, guided by instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere survival. The valley had been his teacher in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Every season brought new lessons. The migration patterns of birds that told him when harsh weather approached. The subtle changes in plant growth that indicated underground water sources. The way certain animals behaved when predators were near. Yet despite his deep knowledge of this place, Kale often felt there were secrets still hidden from him, mysteries that danced just beyond his understanding. River's soft growl broke his reverie. The dog's attention focused on something upstream, his body tense with alert energy. Kyle followed his companion's gaze, but saw only the familiar landscape of rushing water and moss-covered rocks. Still, he had learned long ago to trust River's instincts completely. If the dog sensed something unusual, it deserved attention. They abandoned the fish trap and moved upstream together, Kale's walking stick providing silent support as they navigated the rocky terrain. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to warm under his palm, though he dismissed the sensation as imagination. Such fanciful thoughts had no place in the practical business of survival. The stream led them deeper into the valley's heart, where ancient trees grew so thick their canopy filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns of green and gold. Here the air felt different somehow, heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on Kyle's arms stand up. River moved with increased caution, his nose working constantly to analyze scents that meant nothing to human senses. They reached a clearing where the stream widened into a still pool, its surface so clear it might have been polished glass. Kale had visited this place countless times, drawn by a sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath the water. Today, however, something felt different. The usual birdsong had fallen silent, and even the stream's gentle murmur seemed muted. River approached the water's edge with unusual reverence, lowering his great head to drink. As the dog's tongue touched the surface, Kale could have sworn he saw ripples of light spreading outward, as if the water itself held some inner illumination. He blinked, and the effect vanished, leaving only the natural play of sunlight on moving water. Kneeling beside his companion, Kyle cupped his hands and brought the crystal-clear liquid to his lips. It tasted like nothing he had ever experienced, not just pure, but somehow alive, carrying flavors of ancient stone and deep earth and something else. Something that spoke to a part of him he didn't understand. As they made their way back to complete the morning's tasks, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the valley was trying to tell him something. The carved walking stick felt heavier in his hand, its mysterious symbols seeming to pulse with their own quiet rhythm, keeping time with secrets that had yet to be revealed. The afternoon sun had climbed high enough to chase away the morning's chill when Kyle made his way to the stone circle that crowned a gentle rise overlooking the valley. 7 weathered granite stones, each nearly twice his height, stood arranged in a perfect ring around a natural clearing. He had discovered this place during his early years in the wilderness, drawn by an inexplicable sense of belonging that he had never questioned. River padded alongside him, the dog's massive frame moving with surprising grace through the undergrowth. As they approached the ancient formation, a family of deer looked up from their grazing, showing no fear at their presence. Over the years, Kyle had noticed that animals behaved differently around him, less wary, more accepting, as if they recognized something in him that he himself couldn't identify. Taking his customary seat on the smooth stone that faced east, Kyle set his walking stick beside him and closed his eyes. This had become his thinking place, where the day's experiences settled into memory and understanding. The stones seemed to amplify the peace that dwelt within the valley, creating a sanctuary where his mind could wander freely through the puzzles of his existence. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the granite monoliths. Kale had learned to read the language of the birds, understanding their warnings and celebrations, their territorial disputes and seasonal migrations. The hawk's call today carried no alarm, only a greeting between old friends. He opened his eyes and raised his hand in acknowledgement, watching as the magnificent bird continued its patrol of the valley's borders. River settled at his feet, the dog's breathing deep and relaxed. Sometimes Kyle wondered if his companion came to this place for the same reasons he did, to find clarity in the midst of life's simple complexities. The dog's intelligence never ceased to amaze him. River seemed to understand not just commands and gestures, but emotions and intentions, responding to needs that Kyle hadn't even voiced. A movement in the forest caught his attention. A black bear emerged from the tree line, massive and powerful, yet moving with deliberate calm. Kyle remained perfectly still, knowing from experience that the bear meant no harm. Over the years, he had encountered this same creature many times, and they had developed a mutual respect, born of shared territory and careful boundaries. The bear approached to within 20 feet of the stone circle, then sat back on its haunches like an enormous shaggy dog. River's tail thumped once against the ground in greeting, but neither animal showed any sign of tension or aggression. They regarded each other with the casual acknowledgement of neighbors meeting at a property line. As Kyle watched this peaceful exchange, he reflected on the countless similar encounters that had shaped his understanding of the wilderness. A family of mountain goats that had taught him which ledges were safe to climb. An old elk whose yearly visits marked the changing seasons. Countless smaller creatures, squirrels, chipmunks, marmots, that had shown him which plants were edible and which to avoid. The bear eventually wandered away, disappearing back into the forest with barely a sound despite its considerable size. Kyle leaned back against the ancient stone, feeling its warmth radiating through his spine. The granite held the day's heat like a living thing, and sometimes he imagined he could feel a pulse within the rock itself, as if the stones harbored some deep and patient form of life. From his elevated position, the entire valley spread before him like a detailed map drawn by the hand of nature itself. He could trace the path of the stream as it wound through stands of aspen and pine, marking the locations of his various caches of tools and supplies. To the north, a series of caves provided shelter during the worst winter storms. To the south, hidden meadows burst with edible plants and medicinal herbs. This was his kingdom, earned through years of careful observation and hard-won understanding. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the stream held memories and lessons. He knew where the best materials for tools could be found, which areas provided the most reliable hunting, where to gather the plants that could heal wounds or ease the pain of illness. Yet for all his intimate knowledge of this place, Kale often felt like he was missing something fundamental. There were moments, like this afternoon in the stone circle, when the valley seemed to be trying to communicate with him in a language he couldn't quite grasp. The feeling was strongest here among the ancient monoliths, as if the stones themselves were repositories of wisdom that remained just beyond his reach. River's head lifted suddenly. His ears pricked toward the eastern edge of the valley. The dog's body tensed with alertness, though he made no sound. Kale followed his companion's gaze, but saw nothing unusual in the distant forest. Still, River's instincts had never failed them before. Rising from his contemplation, Kyle gathered his walking stick and began the descent back toward their shelter. Whatever River had sensed could wait until tomorrow to reveal itself. For now, the evening's tasks called, and the familiar routines of survival beckoned them home. As evening shadows lengthened across the valley, Kale made his way to a peculiar formation that had fascinated him since childhood. Near the northern ridge, where wind currents converged in complex patterns, stood what he had come to think of as his weather vane. The natural sculpture consisted of twisted pieces of ancient wood and stone, weathered into an intricate spiral that seemed to capture and respond to the slightest atmospheric changes. The formation had guided him through countless seasons, its subtle movements warning of approaching storms days before clouds gathered on the horizon. Tonight, the twisted elements pointed steadily southwest, indicating several more days of clear weather, perfect for the projects he had planned. River trotted ahead, nose to the ground as he investigated the scents left by the day's visitors. A family of raccoons had passed through recently, along with a lone coyote and something else, a smell that made the dog pause and lift his head with interest. Kale trusted River's nose more than his own eyes. The dog could distinguish between dozens of different animal signatures and even predict their behavior based on scent alone. They continued toward a cluster of caves where Kyle kept his more elaborate tools and artwork. Over the years, he had developed skills that went far beyond mere survival. Long winter evenings had been spent carving intricate patterns into bone and antler, creating tools that were as beautiful as they were functional. The cave walls bore testimony to his artistic evolution. Primitive scratches from his early years had given way to sophisticated paintings that captured the essence of his mountain world. His latest project waited in the deepest chamber, where the rock face provided the perfect canvas for his most ambitious work yet. Using pigments ground from local minerals and berries, he had begun painting a massive mural that depicted the changing seasons of his valley. Spring's tender greens flowed into summer's rich golds, which gradually transformed into autumn's blazing reds and oranges before yielding to winter's stark blues and whites. The painting had consumed months of careful work, each section requiring patient observation of how light and shadow played across the landscape during different times of year. As he added another layer of detail to a grove of aspen trees, Cale felt the familiar satisfaction that came from creating something lasting and meaningful. River settled nearby, content to watch his companion work. The dog's presence had always been a source of comfort during these solitary hours, a reminder that even in this remote wilderness, he was not truly alone. Sometimes Cale caught River studying his artwork with what seemed like genuine appreciation, the dog's intelligent eyes following the flow of color and form across the stone surface. The sound of his own breathing echoed softly in the chamber, mixing with the distant whisper of wind through the cave entrance. These were the moments when Cale felt most connected to his adopted home, when the boundary between himself and the mountain seemed to dissolve entirely. His hands moved with practiced certainty, adding highlights that would capture the way morning sunlight filtered through autumn leaves. As he worked, memories surfaced of his early attempts at artistic expression. He remembered the frustration of trying to mix colors that matched the subtle hues of sunset, the satisfaction of finally mastering the technique that allowed him to paint the texture of bark and stone. Each skill had been hard-won through trial and error, with no teacher but his own determination and the natural world around him. The weather vane's accuracy had proven itself again and again over the years. When it twisted toward the northwest and trembled with a particular rhythm, heavy snow was certain to follow within 2 days. When it pointed due east and remained perfectly still, the next morning would bring fog so thick he could barely see his own feet. Tonight's steady southwestern orientation promised the kind of stable weather that made outdoor work a pleasure rather than a struggle. He had learned to read dozens of other natural signs as well. The behavior of certain birds could predict temperature changes hours in advance. The way spider webs gathered moisture revealed humidity levels that would affect everything from his tool-making to food preservation. Even the pattern of his own breath in the morning air told him volumes about the day ahead. River's ears suddenly perked up, and the dog moved to the cave entrance with silent purpose. Cale set down his painting materials and followed, emerging into the cool evening air just as a great horned owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The sound echoed off the rock faces, creating a haunting melody that seemed to speak of ancient mysteries hidden within the mountain's heart. Together, they stood listening to the night sounds of their domain, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant splash of a beaver working on its dam, the almost inaudible whisper of wind through pine needles. This was their world, complete and perfect in its wild complexity. A paradise that asked nothing more than respectful coexistence with its rhythms and seasons. The morning that would change everything began like countless others before it. Cale woke to River's soft whining, a sound that usually meant the dog needed to relieve himself or had detected some minor disturbance in their territory. But as consciousness fully returned, he realized this was different. River stood rigid at the entrance to their shelter, every muscle tense, with an alertness that spoke of genuine concern. Stepping outside, Cale immediately noticed what had captured his companion's attention: the usual symphony of morning sounds. Birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a hawk, had fallen unnaturally silent. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the trees seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. River's nose worked frantically, processing scents that clearly disturbed him. The dog's hackles rose slightly, not in aggression, but in the careful wariness of a creature sensing something fundamentally wrong with his world. Kyle had learned to read these subtle signs over their years together, and River's current behavior sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. They moved together through the forest with unusual caution, following game trails that Kyle knew as well as the lines on his own palms. River ranged ahead, then circled back, his movements more deliberate than his usual casual exploration. Whatever had disturbed the dog was leading them toward the eastern edge of their territory, an area Kyle rarely visited because it bordered the steeper slopes that eventually led to the outside world. The first sign of intrusion appeared near a cluster of boulders, where mountain sheep often gathered to graze. Deep grooves scarred the earth, tracks unlike anything Kale had ever seen. They were too wide and regular to have been made by any animal, carved into the soft ground with mechanical precision that spoke of human activity. River approached the strange marks with extreme caution, sniffing carefully at the edges. His low growl confirmed what Kale had already begun to suspect. Strangers had entered their domain. The realization hit him like a physical blow, shattering the peaceful certainty that had defined his entire adult life. Following the tracks led them deeper into unfamiliar emotions. Kale found himself experiencing something he had never felt before, a combination of territorial protectiveness and deep anxiety that made his hands shake slightly as he gripped his walking stick. The tracks continued in a straight line, showing no regard for the natural contours of the landscape or the delicate ecosystems they were disturbing. It was River who found the first piece of evidence. The dog's sharp bark drew Kyle's attention to a small metallic object partially hidden beneath a fallen log. Kneeling carefully, Kyle retrieved what appeared to be some kind of navigational device, though unlike anything he had ever imagined. The round metal case contained a needle that spun wildly without settling in any direction, as if the device itself was confused by its surroundings. The object felt alien in his hands, cold, angular, manufactured rather than grown. Its surface bore tiny markings that meant nothing to him, symbols as mysterious as those carved into his walking stick, but somehow less organic, less connected to the natural world around them. The needle's frantic spinning made him dizzy to watch, and he quickly closed the device and tucked it into his leather pouch. The discovery filled him with questions he had never needed to ask before. Who were these intruders? What did they want in his peaceful valley? The very existence of the strange device suggested a level of sophistication and organization that made his simple life seem suddenly fragile and threatened. River's continued agitation confirmed that the intrusion was more extensive than just a few tracks and a dropped object. The dog's usual confidence had been replaced by a wariness that broke Kale's heart to witness. For 20 years, this valley had been their sanctuary, a place where they belonged without question or challenge. Now that certainty had been shattered by evidence of a world beyond their borders that neither welcomed nor understood their existence. As they made their way back toward familiar territory, Kale found himself seeing his home through different eyes. The paths that had always seemed perfectly secure now felt exposed and vulnerable. The clearings, where he had always felt safely hidden, now seemed open to observation from unknown watchers. Even his beloved stone circle felt somehow diminished by the knowledge that others now knew of its existence. The broken compass, for that was what he decided to call the strange device, seemed to pulse with significance in his pouch. Its weight was minimal, but its implications were enormous. The peaceful isolation that had defined his entire adult life was over, replaced by an uncertainty that made his stomach churn with unfamiliar anxiety. River pressed close to his side as they walked, offering the comfort of partnership in the face of these troubling developments. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced every other obstacle in their shared life among the mountains. 3 days passed before Kyle mustered the courage to follow the strange tracks deeper into the disturbed sections of his territory. River had grown increasingly restless during those days, pacing the perimeter of their usual haunts and whining softly whenever they approached the areas where the foreign scents lingered strongest. Sleep had become elusive for both of them, filled with dreams that felt more like warnings than simple night visions. The trail led them through a section of forest that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Broken branches hung at unnatural angles, and the undergrowth had been trampled by something much heavier than any native wildlife. Fresh blazes marked several trees, crude slashes that spoke of hurried passage and complete disregard for the living wood. Each mark felt like a wound against Cale's sensibilities, evidence of a mindset that saw the forest as merely an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a living community to be respected. River's hackles remained raised as they pushed deeper into the violated landscape. The dog's usual confident stride had been replaced by a cautious, almost stalking gait that reminded Cale of how River behaved when approaching potentially dangerous predators. Every few steps the dog would freeze and test the air, his sensitive nose passing information that remained invisible to human senses. The first glimpse of the intrusion's true scope came when they crested a small ridge overlooking what had once been a pristine meadow. Below them, the natural grassland had been scarred by the presence of large vehicles, their heavy treads leaving deep ruts in soil that had been undisturbed for decades. The sight made Cale's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and grief he had never experienced before, but it was what they found at the far edge of the meadow that truly shattered his understanding of his situation. A temporary camp had been established there, complete with the remnants of a fire pit and several areas where sleeping gear had obviously been deployed. The intruders had not simply passed through his domain, they had made themselves at home in it. Among the scattered debris of their occupation, Kyle discovered an object that defied his comprehension entirely. The rectangular device was no larger than his hand, but its smooth black surface and array of small buttons suggested a complexity that made his head spin. Unlike the broken compass, this artifact appeared to be in perfect working condition. Though its purpose remained completely mysterious, River approached the strange object with extreme caution, sniffing delicately at its edges without actually touching it. The dog's behavior suggested that the device carried sense and implications far beyond Cale's ability to interpret. Whatever this thing was, it clearly represented technology and capabilities that existed in a world completely separate from his own. As he held the device, Kyle noticed tiny symbols glowing faintly on its surface, numbers and letters that shifted and changed as he watched. The display pulsed with a regular rhythm that reminded him uncomfortably of a heartbeat, as if the object possessed some form of artificial life. The very idea made him want to drop it immediately, but his curiosity proved stronger than his revulsion. The camp showed signs of having been occupied for several days, possibly even weeks. The fire pit contained multiple layers of ash, indicating repeated use over an extended period. Food containers and other debris suggested a level of organization and planning that filled Cale with deep unease. This was no casual exploration or accidental intrusion. Someone had been studying his valley with deliberate intent. More disturbing still were the signs that the intruders had been documenting their presence. Rectangular impressions in the soft earth near the camp's perimeter suggested that additional devices had been set up and later removed. The implications were staggering. Not only had strangers invaded his sanctuary, but they had been recording their findings for purposes he couldn't begin to imagine. The mysterious device in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, weighted with significance that extended far beyond its physical mass. Its smooth surface felt unnaturally warm against his palm, and he found himself fighting the irrational fear that it might be communicating his location to its creators even as he held it. River's continued agitation finally prompted Kyle to make a decision. Whatever this camp represented, whatever these devices signified, he needed to understand the full extent of the intrusion before determining his response. But first, he had to secure this evidence and decide what to do with knowledge that challenged everything he had believed about his isolated existence. As they prepared to leave the violated meadow, Kale took one last look at the scarred landscape and felt something fundamental shift within his understanding of his place in the world. The sanctuary that had sheltered and nurtured him for 20 years was no longer secret, no longer safe, no longer his alone. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, changing him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Over the following week, Kyle's entire world transformed from sanctuary to battlefield, though the war being waged remained largely invisible to his untrained eyes. He had begun ranging further from his usual haunts, driven by a need to understand the full scope of the intrusion that had shattered his peaceful existence. River accompanied him on these reconnaissance missions with the focused intensity of a military scout, the dog's playful nature replaced by grim purpose. It was during one of these expanded patrols that they discovered the first of what Kale would later realize was an extensive surveillance network. Hidden among the branches of an ancient oak, positioned to overlook one of his favorite resting spots, hung a small rectangular device that immediately set River to growling with deep suspicion. The object was roughly the size of Kale's closed fist, covered in a mottled pattern that would have made it nearly invisible to casual observation. A dark lens stared out from its center like a single unblinking eye, and though Kale had no understanding of its true function, the device's very presence felt like a violation of the most intimate kind. Someone had been watching him, studying his movements with an attention to detail that made his skin crawl. River's reaction to the discovery was more intense than anything Kyle had previously witnessed. The normally steady dog trembled with suppressed energy, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed white in the dappled sunlight. The message was clear. This was not merely an intrusion, but an act of predation, and River's every instinct screamed danger. As they examined the mysterious watcher, Kyle noticed other disturbing details. The device was secured to the tree with materials that showed no signs of weathering, suggesting it had been placed recently. More troubling still, a small indicator light pulsed with regular intervals, implying that the thing was not merely recording, but actively transmitting information to some distant receiver. The implications of this discovery sent Kale's mind reeling through possibilities he had never needed to consider. How long had he been under observation? What details of his daily life had been captured and analyzed by unknown watchers? The very thought of strangers studying his most private moments filled him with a rage so pure and focused that his hands shook as he gripped his walking stick, but anger quickly gave way to more practical concerns. If this device existed here, how many others might be scattered throughout his territory? The idea that his every movement might be monitored and recorded transformed his familiar landscape into a maze of potential surveillance points. Every tree, every boulder, every natural shelter now seemed suspect. River's continued agitation reminded him that immediate action was required. Carefully, Kyle used his knife to cut the device free from its mounting, wrapping it in a piece of leather to muffle any sounds it might be making. The weight of the object seemed disproportionate to its size, heavy with implications that extended far beyond its physical presence. As they made their way back towards safer territory, Kale found himself moving with a caution that would have seemed paranoid just days earlier. He avoided his usual paths, stuck to cover whenever possible, and constantly checked their back trail for signs of pursuit. The easy confidence that had characterized his movement through the wilderness for 20 years had been replaced by the furtive awareness of prey animals in predator territory. The captured device seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in his pack, a constant reminder that his sanctuary had been compromised in ways he was only beginning to understand. River's behavior confirmed his growing paranoia. The dog now moved, as if expecting attack from any direction, his usual joy in exploration replaced by grim vigilance. That evening, as they huddled in a cave he rarely used, Cale examined his prize more carefully. The device bore markings similar to those on the satellite phone, symbols that suggested a level of technological sophistication completely beyond his experience. Whatever civilization had created these tools possessed capabilities that made his simple survival skills seem primitive by comparison. Most disturbing of all was the realization that his capture of this single watcher had probably alerted his enemies to his awareness of their surveillance. The device's obvious transmission capabilities meant that its sudden silence would be noticed, investigated, and responded to. By acting to protect his privacy, he had probably sacrificed the advantage of anonymity that might have served him better in the long run. River's low whine drew his attention to the cave entrance, where the dog stood silhouetted against the gathering darkness. Even in this remote hiding place, his companion remained alert for threats that might emerge from the night. The sight of River's unwavering vigilance both comforted and saddened Cale. Their partnership had evolved from joyful companionship to desperate alliance in the space of a few short days. As sleep proved elusive once again, Kyle found himself planning countermeasures against an enemy he didn't understand, using resources that seemed laughably inadequate to the task. The next phase of Cale's education in the reality of his situation came when River led him to a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood about the intruder's intentions. Hidden beneath a waterproof covering near the violated meadow, they found a collection of papers that spoke to planning and knowledge that went far beyond casual exploration. The largest document was unlike anything Cale had ever seen, a detailed rendering of his entire valley that showed intimate knowledge of terrain he had assumed was known only to himself and the creatures who shared his domain. Every stream, every ridge, every significant landmark had been mapped with meticulous precision, reduced to lines and symbols that transformed his living world into an abstract puzzle. But it was the additional markings overlaying the natural features that filled him with cold dread. Red circles highlighted specific locations throughout the valley, each accompanied by cryptic notations that meant nothing to him, but clearly held great significance for whoever had created this document. Some circles marked areas he recognized as particularly beautiful or peaceful: the stone circle, where he often contemplated, the pristine pool where he and River drank, the hidden grove where he gathered medicinal plants. Other markings were more ominous still. Yellow triangles clustered around what appeared to be underground features, suggesting that the mapmakers possessed knowledge of geological structures that lay hidden beneath the familiar surface of his world. The implications were staggering. These strangers understood aspects of his home that he himself had never suspected. River's investigation of the papers revealed additional layers of violation. The dog's sensitive nose detected multiple human scents on the documents, indicating that several different people had handled them. More disturbing still, River's reaction suggested that at least some of these scents were recent, meaning the surveillance and planning were ongoing rather than historical. Among the papers, Kyle found technical drawings that depicted structures and installations completely foreign to his experience. The precise lines and mechanical details spoke of engineering capabilities that existed in a realm of knowledge as distant from his simple life as the stars themselves. Whatever these intruders were planning, it involved construction and modification of his valley on a scale that would transform it beyond recognition. One particular diagram showed a series of pipes and pumping stations that seemed designed to extract something from deep underground. The drawing was annotated with numbers and calculations that meant nothing to Kyle, but the intent was clear enough. Someone wanted to drain his valley of some resource he hadn't even known existed. The more he studied the documents, the more apparent it became that his home held value he had never suspected. The detailed geological survey revealed mineral deposits, underground water systems, and other natural features that existed far beneath the surface reality he had always known. His simple life of hunting, gathering, and artistic expression was built atop treasures that had attracted attention from the outside. Most heartbreaking of all were the environmental impact assessments that coldly catalogued the valley's wildlife populations and plant communities as obstacles to be managed rather than treasures to be preserved. The animals he considered friends and neighbors were reduced to numbers on charts, their habitats classified according to their interference with planned extraction operations. River's continued agitation reminded Cale that they were not safely hidden even in this remote location. The dog's ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds and movements that remained beyond human perception. Every few minutes, River would freeze and test the air, his body language suggesting the nearby presence of threats that might emerge at any moment. The weight of revelation pressed down on Kyle with crushing force as he realized that his entire adult life had been built on an illusion of isolation that had never really existed. These papers proved that his valley had been studied, surveyed, and targeted long before he had become aware of any intrusion. The peaceful sanctuary he had thought of as his own had always been vulnerable to forces he couldn't comprehend or resist. Carefully rolling the documents and securing them in his pack, Kyle felt the burden of knowledge settling onto his shoulders like a physical weight. The information these papers contained would be crucial to understanding what he was facing, but the very act of possessing them put him in greater danger than ever before. Their absence would certainly be noticed, and their theft would mark him as an active threat rather than merely an obstacle. As they prepared to leave this latest scene of violation, River's sharp bark warned of approaching danger. In the distance, Kyle could hear the unnatural sounds of machinery moving through his forest, engines and metal tracks that spoke of forces returning to continue their systematic destruction of everything he held dear. Together, they melted back into the wilderness, carrying with them evidence of a conspiracy that threatened not just their peaceful existence, but the very soul of the mountain, paradise that had shaped them both. The violation that struck deepest at Cale's heart came when he discovered what the intruders had done to the sacred sites scattered throughout his valley. Following River's increasingly agitated tracking, they arrived at a secluded canyon where ancient peoples had left their mark on the living rock thousands of years before Cale's birth. What they found there shattered something fundamental in his understanding of respect and boundaries. The petroglyphs that had watched over the valley for countless generations showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Someone had used modern techniques to create detailed reproductions of the sacred symbols, leaving behind evidence of their theft in the form of paper impressions pressed against the ancient stone. The careful rubbings captured every line and curve of the original carvings, reducing millennia of spiritual significance to mere data to be catalogued and studied. River's reaction to the desecrated site was immediate and visceral. The normally gentle dog began a low, continuous growling that spoke of outrage beyond simple territorial defense. The sound carried an almost human quality of grief and anger, as if River understood the cultural significance of what had been violated in ways that went beyond simple animal instinct. Kyle knelt beside the ancient wall, running his fingers over stone surfaces that had been disturbed for the first time in his memory. The petroglyphs depicted scenes he had spent years contemplating: hunters and prey locked in eternal dance, celestial bodies marking the passage of seasons, mysterious figures that seemed to bridge the gap between human and animal forms. Each image held layers of meaning that had revealed themselves gradually over his years of patient observation. Among the scattered materials left behind by the thieves, Cale found fragments of the paper used to create the rubbings. The torn pieces bore partial images of the sacred symbols, reduced to black marks on white paper that stripped away all context and reverence. The sight filled him with a rage more pure and focused than anything he had experienced, even during his worst moments of territorial violation. But it was the notebook pages, mixed among the rubbing materials, that revealed the true scope of the cultural theft being perpetrated. The handwritten notes discussed the petroglyphs in clinical terms, analyzing their potential age and artistic value while completely ignoring their spiritual significance. Phrases like primitive art forms and archaeological commodities leapt from the pages, each word a dagger thrust into Cale's understanding of how the outside world viewed his sacred inheritance. The notes revealed that multiple sites throughout the valley had been similarly violated. A systematic survey had identified and documented every petroglyph panel, every ancient shelter, every location where the old ones had left their mark. The thieves possessed maps showing sacred sites that Cale had thought were known only to himself and the spirits who dwelt within the stone. Rivers continued. Surveillance of their surroundings reminded Cale that they remained in danger even in this remote location. The dog's behavior had evolved beyond simple alertness into something approaching military reconnaissance, his movements calculated to provide maximum warning while maintaining concealment. The transformation of his gentle companion into a creature of such focused wariness broke Cale's heart even as it filled him with gratitude for their partnership. The deeper implications of the cultural theft gradually became clear as Cale studied the scattered evidence. These were not random acts of vandalism, but part of a comprehensive effort to document and claim everything of value within his domain. The intruder saw his valley not as a living ecosystem deserving of respect, but as a resource to be catalogued, quantified, and ultimately exploited. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the violation of these sacred sites represented a form of spiritual warfare he had never imagined possible. The petroglyphs had served as guardians and teachers for countless generations, their presence sanctifying the valley and connecting it to powers older than human memory. By reducing them to mere archaeological curiosities, the intruders were systematically stripping away the protective influences that had kept his home safe for millennia. As he carefully gathered the scattered evidence of this latest violation, Cale felt something fundamental shift within his relationship to the valley around him. No longer was he simply a caretaker living in harmony with the natural world. He had become the last guardian of cultural treasures that predated his own existence by thousands of years. The weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders with a gravity that changed his very understanding of his place in the world. River's sharp bark warned that their time at the violated site was ending. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles reminded them that the thieves might return at any moment to complete their systematic plundering of everything sacred within the valley's borders. Together, they withdrew deeper into the wilderness, carrying with them evidence of violations that went far beyond simple trespass into realms of cultural desecration that demanded response beyond mere defensive measures. The pieces of the puzzle began forming a terrifying picture when Cale discovered the expedition's main documentation cache hidden beneath a camouflage tarp near their primary base camp. River had led him there through a circuitous route that avoided the most heavily monitored areas, the dog's newfound tactical awareness proving invaluable in navigating their increasingly dangerous territory. The leather-bound journal they found contained weeks of detailed observations written in a precise hand that spoke of scientific training and methodical investigation. As Cale struggled through the unfamiliar script, the true scope of the threat facing his valley gradually revealed itself in entries that catalogued discoveries and theories with chilling clinical detachment. The early entries focused on mundane geological surveys and wildlife observations, but as the expedition progressed, the tone shifted towards something approaching excitement and greed. References to unusual magnetic readings and unprecedented mineral compositions filled page after page, each entry building toward conclusions that made Cale's blood run cold. It was the entry dated just 3 days earlier that shattered his remaining illusions about the intruder's intentions. The writer described the discovery of what they termed the source, an underground spring whose waters displayed properties that defied conventional scientific explanation. Laboratory analysis had apparently confirmed that the water contained elements unknown to modern chemistry, with effects on living tissue that bordered on the miraculous. River's continuous vigilance reminded Kyle that they were reading stolen secrets in enemy territory, but the journal's revelations were too important to abandon. Each page revealed new layers of threat and opportunity that the expedition saw in his beloved valley. The scientists weren't simply studying his home, they were preparing to harvest it. The journal's author wrote extensively about test subjects, small animals captured from the valley and exposed to the mysterious water under controlled conditions. The clinical descriptions of enhanced healing rates, increased longevity, and improved physical capabilities read like something from a fever dream, but the detailed measurements and repeated experiments suggested that the impossible was indeed possible. Most disturbing were the speculation pages where the writer theorized about the commercial applications of their discoveries. Pharmaceutical companies, military contractors, and private collectors were all mentioned as potential buyers for what the journal called the fountain of youth, the casual discussion of profits to be made from his valley's resources filled Cale with a rage that transcended anything he had previously experienced. But it was the final entries that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The expedition was merely the advance team for a much larger operation that would transform his valley into an industrial extraction site. Plans were already in motion to bring in heavy machinery, establish permanent facilities, and begin large-scale harvesting of the mystical waters that had flowed. Undisturbed for millennia, River's sudden alertness drew Kyle's attention away from the journal as the dog's ears tracked sounds that remained beyond human perception. The approaching rumble of engines suggested that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. But the information they had gathered was too valuable to abandon, quickly photographing the most crucial pages with the expedition's own abandoned camera, another piece of evidence that revealed the intruder's sophisticated documentation. Methods, Kyle prepared to retreat before discovery became inevitable. The irony of using the enemy's own tools against them was not lost on him. Though the satisfaction was tempered by the magnitude of what they were facing, the journal had confirmed his worst fears while revealing others he hadn't imagined. His valley wasn't just being invaded, it was being prepared for systematic destruction in the name of profit and scientific advancement. The springs that had sustained him and countless generations of wildlife were viewed as nothing more than a resource to be exploited until exhausted, more personally threatening, were the scattered references throughout the journal to the indigenous subject, clearly meaning himself. The expedition was well aware of his presence and had been studying his movements and behaviors as part of their overall assessment of the valley's assets and obstacles. They knew exactly who he was and where he lived, viewing him as simply another element to be managed during their planned extraction operations. As they withdrew from the compromised area, River's protective positioning reminded Kyle that their reconnaissance missions were becoming increasingly dangerous. The expedition's return to active operations meant that their window for gathering intelligence was rapidly closing. While their need for strategic planning was becoming more urgent with each revelation, the weight of the stolen knowledge pressed down on Kyle as they made their way back to safer territory. He now understood not just what the intruders wanted, but how they planned to take it. The systematic nature of their approach, the industrial scale of their ambitions, and the complete disregard for the valley's existing ecosystem painted a picture of destruction that seemed almost too vast to contemplate. Yet contemplation was exactly what the situation demanded, for knowledge without action would prove useless against forces that viewed his entire world as nothing more than raw material waiting to be processed. The escalation from covert observation to direct confrontation came sooner than Kyle had anticipated. River's increasingly urgent warnings had drawn them to a vantage point overlooking the expedition's expanded base camp, where they witnessed the arrival of the operation's leadership for the first time. What Kyle saw there challenged his understanding of both the enemy he faced and the mysterious forces that had shaped his own existence. The woman who emerged from the lead vehicle moved with an authority that immediately marked her as the expedition's commander. But it was what she wore around her neck that made Kyle's breath catch in his throat, a pendant that seemed to pulse. Within a light, casting subtle rainbows that danced across her clothing, even in the diffused forest shadows. River's reaction to the sight was immediate and profound. The dog's hackles rose, not in aggression, but in something approaching awe, his body trembling with recognition of forces that transcended ordinary understanding. A low whine escaped his throat, the sound carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with something deep within Kyle's own chest. Through careful observation from their concealed position, Kyle watched as the pendant's glow intensified whenever its wearer approached certain areas of the camp. The light was strongest when she moved toward equipment that had obviously been positioned to monitor the valley's underground water systems, confirming what the journal had only hinted at. These people possessed technology capable of detecting the mystical energies that Kyle had always sensed, but never understood. The woman's movements showed a familiarity with the valley's hidden properties that went beyond simple scientific study. She navigated the camp with confidence that spoke of previous experience with similar sites. Her attention focused on readings and measurements that clearly held profound significance for the expedition's ultimate goals. But it was her interaction with the mysterious pendant that revealed the true sophistication of the forces arrayed against him. As Kyle watched, she held the crystal to her ear, as if listening to whispered instructions, her expression shifting between concentration and satisfaction as she received information from a source that defied his comprehension. River's continued agitation reminded Kyle that they were observing something far more dangerous than simple corporate greed or scientific curiosity. The pendant's obvious connection to supernatural forces suggested that his enemies understood aspects of the valley's true nature that he himself had never fully grasped. They weren't simply planning to exploit unknown resources, they were preparing to harness powers that had protected his sanctuary for millennia. The woman's consultation with her team revealed additional layers of threat that made Kyle's strategic situation even more precarious. She spoke with the authority of someone who had encountered similar mystical sights before, her instructions delivered with the confidence of proven experience in dealing with supernatural phenomena. Most disturbing of all was the reverent way she handled the pendant, treating it not as mere jewelry, but as a tool of profound significance. The crystal's responsive glow suggested an active connection to the same energies that had always made certain areas of the valley feel special to Kyle, though he had never possessed the knowledge to interpret those sensations properly. As the team prepared to deploy additional equipment throughout the valley, Kyle realized that his enemies possessed advantages he had never imagined. Their technology was sophisticated enough to detect and measure mystical energies, while their leadership showed familiarity with supernatural phenomena that spoke of extensive prior experience. River's sudden alertness warned of approaching patrol units that forced them to withdraw before their observation could continue. But the brief glimpse of the expedition's true capabilities had provided crucial intelligence about the nature of the forces threatening his home. The pendant's obvious power suggested that the mystical spring's influence extended far beyond the valley's borders, attracting attention from organizations that specialized in locating and exploiting supernatural resources. His sanctuary hadn't been discovered by accident. It had been targeted by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. As they made their way back through increasingly hostile territory, Kyle found himself grappling with revelations that challenged everything he thought he understood about his place in the world. The valley's mystical properties weren't unique accidents of nature, but part of a larger network of supernatural sites that attracted attention from forces beyond his comprehension. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him with crushing force, as he realized that his simple life of harmony with nature had been built atop powers that connected him to conflicts and responsibilities extending far beyond his mountain sanctuary. The pendant-wearing woman represented not just immediate threat, but evidence of a larger war being waged between forces he was only beginning to understand. River's protective positioning as they traveled reminded Kale that whatever challenges lay ahead, their partnership remained the one constant in a world that was revealing new layers of complexity and danger with each passing day. The true scope of the violation became clear when Kale discovered that the intruders had found and defiled the heart of his valley's power. Following River's increasingly frantic tracking through terrain that had become a maze of surveillance, equipment and hidden sensors, they arrived at the sacred grove that sheltered the mystical spring to find evidence of theft that struck at the very soul of his sanctuary. The crystalline vial they found abandoned near the spring's edge contained water that should never have been removed from its source. Even separated from the ancient stones and protected earth that had cradled it for millennia, the liquid within, the glass container pulsed with inner light that seemed to respond to Kale's presence. The sight of his valley's most sacred essence, trapped within foreign materials, filled him with grief so profound that his knees buckled beneath the weight of it. River's reaction to the violated spring was immediate and heartbreaking. The dog approached the water's edge with reverent caution, then began a low, keening sound that seemed to carry the mourning of every creature that had ever drawn sustenance from these blessed waters. The sound spoke of loss that transcended simple territorial violation, touching on spiritual dimensions that Kyle was only beginning to understand. The spring itself showed clear signs of systematic sampling and analysis. Foreign instruments had been inserted into the sacred pool, their sterile metal surfaces still visible beneath the water's surface like wounds that refused to heal. The natural flow patterns that had remained unchanged for countless centuries showed disturbance that spoke of interference with forces that had never been meant for human manipulation. But it was the detailed notes left behind by the expedition's scientists that revealed the true magnitude of what had been discovered and stolen. The water's properties had been documented with clinical precision that reduced miracle to mere chemistry, though the measurements themselves told a story that defied conventional understanding. Cell regeneration rates increased by factors that should have been impossible. Aging processes not merely slowed, but actually reversed. DNA damage repaired at speeds that challenged the fundamental laws of biology. River's continued vigilance reminded Kale that they remained in immediate danger even in this most sacred of locations. The dog's behavior suggested that the sampling expedition had been extensive and recent, with human scent still fresh enough to indicate possible imminent return. The vial in Kyle's hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, weighted with significance that extended far beyond its physical mass. The water within pulsed with rhythms that matched his own heartbeat, as if the separated essence was trying to communicate with him through frequencies that bypassed normal understanding. As he studied the container more closely, Kyle noticed that the water's glow intensified when he held it near certain areas around the spring. The light was strongest when the vial approached the ancient symbols carved into the rocks that formed the pool's natural basin, symbols that matched those etched into his walking stick and scattered throughout the valley's most sacred sites. The connection sent a shock of recognition through his consciousness that changed everything he thought he understood about his relationship to this place. The walking stick wasn't simply a tool he had found by accident. It was part of a larger pattern of artifacts and signs that marked him as something more than a random refugee who had stumbled into sanctuary. River's sudden alertness drew his attention to movement in the forest around the spring. Through the undergrowth, Kyle could see the deliberate approach of figures moving with military precision toward their location. The expedition's security team had apparently detected their presence, ending their reconnaissance mission and forcing immediate retreat. But as they prepared to withdraw from the violated sanctuary, the vial in Kale's possession began exhibiting properties that defied simple explanation. The water's glow had synchronized with his pulse, and he could feel warmth spreading through his hands that seemed to carry information rather than simple heat. Images flashed through his mind, glimpses of the valley as it had existed in ages past, when other guardians had protected. The spring from different threats, the stolen water sample, wasn't just evidence of violation, it was a key that was unlocking memories and knowledge that had been dormant within him since childhood. As they fled through the forest with pursuit closing behind them, Kale felt the first stirrings of understanding about his true role in the valley's ancient cycles of protection and renewal. River's expert guidance through the maze of surveillance equipment suggested that the dog's intelligence encompassed knowledge that went far beyond normal animal instincts. Together, they navigated escape routes that seemed to reveal themselves just when needed, as if the valley itself was providing assistance to its designated protectors. The weight of revelation and responsibility settled onto Kyle's shoulders as they reached temporary safety. Carrying with them evidence of theft that had awakened powers he was only beginning to comprehend. The transformation that had been building within Kale reached its first crucial threshold during a night of profound spiritual awakening that changed everything. He thought he understood about his identity and purpose, hidden deep within a cave system he had never explored before. Guided by instincts that seemed to come from somewhere outside his conscious mind, he discovered an artifact that would unlock the supernatural heritage he had carried unknowingly for 20 years. The bone whistle lay partially buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment, its surface polished smooth by countless hands that had held it in ages past. River's behavior upon entering the cave had been unlike anything Kale had previously witnessed. The dog moved with reverent purpose toward the exact location where the ancient instrument waited, as if following instructions audible only to his enhanced senses. As Kale's fingers closed around the whistle, warmth flooded through his body that had nothing to do with physical temperature. The bone itself seemed alive with energy that resonated through every cell of his being, awakening pathways of awareness that had been dormant since his earliest childhood. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly connected to something larger than his simple existence as a wilderness survivor. River's response to the whistle's discovery was immediate and profound. The dog's eyes took on a quality of intelligence that transcended normal animal consciousness, fixing Kale with a gaze that seemed to carry decades of patient waiting finally reaching fulfillment. In that moment, Kale understood that his companion had always known this day would come, had been guiding him toward this revelation through years of seemingly random explorations and discoveries. When he raised the whistle to his lips and released the first tentative breath, the sound that emerged was unlike anything his human ears had ever processed. The note carried harmonics that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls of the cave itself, creating resonances that awakened responses from forces he had never known existed. The mountain's answer came as whispers that filled his consciousness without entering through his physical senses. Voices of guardians who had protected the valley through countless generations spoke to him in languages older than recorded history, sharing knowledge that had been preserved in the stone and water and living wood of his sanctuary. Through their guidance, Kyle learned that his abandonment as a child had been no accident, but part of a pattern that stretched back through millennia. Each generation of guardians was chosen in childhood and raised by the valley itself, their human families replaced by the greater family of all living things that called the sacred space home. River's transformation began during that first night of awakening. The dog's physical form, shimmering with energies that revealed his true nature as something far more than a simple animal companion. The loyal friend who had shared his daily struggles for survival was also a mystical guardian whose intelligence and abilities operated on levels that connected him directly to the mountain's protective spirits. The whistle's call reached beyond the immediate cave system to awaken responses throughout the valley. Animals that had always seemed unusually comfortable with Kale's presence emerged from the forest to gather at the cave entrance, their eyes reflecting an awareness that spoke of shared purpose and ancient allegiances. Through the night, the spirit voices shared visions of the valley's history that revealed the true scope of what was now under threat. The mystical spring was not simply a source of healing waters, but the heart of a network of energy that connected sacred sites across the entire continent. Its violation would weaken protective forces that had shielded countless communities from dangers that existed beyond the normal worlds. Understanding the weight of inherited responsibility settled onto Kyle's shoulders as he learned that the current crisis was only the latest in a series of challenges that had tested each generation of guardians. The corporate expedition threatening his valley was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that sought to harvest supernatural resources for profit, without regard for the consequences to the natural and spiritual worlds. River's enhanced communication abilities allowed him to serve as translator for spirits whose languages predated human speech. Through their partnership, Kyle gained access to strategic knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years of successful resistance to various forms of invasion and exploitation. As dawn approached, the whistle's awakening power reached its full potential within Kale's transformed consciousness. He could feel connections forming to every living thing within the valley's borders, creating a network of awareness that would allow him to coordinate defenses using resources he had never imagined. Possessing the simple young man who had entered the cave as a wilderness survivor emerged as something entirely different, a guardian, awakened to his true heritage and armed with powers that had been growing within him since childhood. River's eyes reflected pride and satisfaction as their partnership evolved into something approaching true equality between mystical beings united in purpose. The whistle's call continued to echo through the valley long after Kyle had lowered it from his lips. Its summons awakening forces that would transform his struggle from desperate survival into strategic resistance against enemies who had no understanding of what they had truly chosen to challenge. The physical manifestation of Kale's transformation came with the dawn following his spiritual awakening, when he discovered that his body now bore the mark of his accepted role as the valley's chosen protector. Around his neck, where no ornament had existed the night before, hung a bronze medallion that seemed to have materialized from the very essence of his connection to the ancient guardian lineage. The medallion's surface bore symbols that matched those carved into his walking stick and etched into the sacred stones throughout the valley. But now these mysterious markings held meaning that flowed directly into his consciousness. Each swirling pattern represented aspects of the guardian's responsibility: protection of the living water, communion with the mountain spirits, coordination of the natural defenses that had preserved the sanctuary for countless generations. River's response to the medallion's appearance confirmed its significance. Beyond any doubt Kale might have harbored, the transformed dog approached with reverence that bordered on worship, his enhanced intelligence recognizing symbols of authority that had been passed down through an unbroken chain of guardians, stretching back to the valley's earliest days. As Kale explored his newfound abilities, he discovered that the medallion served as more than mere symbol. It was a tool that amplified and focused the supernatural powers that had always existed within the valley's borders. When he concentrated on its warming presence against his chest, his awareness expanded to encompass every living thing within miles of his location. Through this enhanced perception, he could feel the fear and confusion of wildlife displaced by the expedition's intrusions. The natural harmony that had defined the valley's ecosystem for millennia was being systematically destroyed by the presence of foreign energies and mechanical disruptions that poisoned the very air with their unnatural resonances. But the medallion also revealed resources for resistance that had been hidden from his ordinary senses. Networks of underground streams carried messages between distant parts of the valley, allowing coordination of defensive efforts across vast areas. Ancient trees held within their living wood the accumulated wisdom of centuries, offering strategic guidance to those capable of interpreting their slow, patient communication. River's own transformation had progressed to the point where verbal communication between them was no longer necessary. The dog's consciousness now operated on levels that allowed direct sharing of thoughts and intentions, creating a partnership that functioned with the seamless coordination of a single mind distributed across two bodies. Together, they began the systematic preparation that would transform the valley from vulnerable sanctuary into fortress capable of withstanding the technological assault being planned against it. The medallion's guidance led them to hidden caches of materials left by previous guardians, tools and weapons crafted from substances that existed nowhere else in the natural world. Each discovery reinforced Kyle's understanding that his role in the valley's defense had been anticipated and prepared for across generations. The medallion grew warmer as it led him to locations where the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds were thinnest, places where his inherited powers could be exercised with maximum effectiveness. The weight of ancestral expectation pressed down on Kyle as he realized that every guardian before him had faced similar moments of choice between personal safety and collective responsibility. The medallion carried within its bronze surface the accumulated experience of dozens of protectors who had chosen to stand against various forms of exploitation and invasion. River's enhanced abilities revealed the true scope of the surveillance network that the expedition had established throughout the valley. But the dog's supernatural senses also detected weaknesses in their electronic systems, places where the mystical energies that protected the sanctuary interfered with the function of modern technology. As they moved through their transformed landscape, Kale felt the medallion's influence extending his connection to include not just the valley's wildlife, but the very stones and streams that formed its physical foundation. The mountain itself was becoming his ally, offering defenses that no human technology could anticipate or counter. The medallion's most profound gift was the knowledge that he was not facing this crisis alone. Through its connection to the guardian lineage, Kyle could draw upon tactical experience accumulated over thousands of years of successful resistance to threats that had taken many different forms throughout history. River's protective positioning as they completed their reconnaissance reminded Kale that the time for preparation was rapidly running out. The expedition's plans were advancing toward a timeline that would soon force direct confrontation. Whether he felt ready or not, The bronze medallion pulsed with warmth against his chest, as if responding to his thoughts, its ancient symbol seeming to shift and flow with energies that promised capabilities beyond his current understanding. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them armed with powers that connected him to every guardian who had ever accepted the responsibility of protecting this sacred place. The weight of the medallion was nothing compared to the weight of knowing that the valley's survival now rested entirely on his shoulders and his partnership with the mystical being who had once been simply his faithful dog. The revelation that shattered Kyle's understanding of his solitary burden came when River led him to a hidden chamber deep within the mountain's heart, where a leather-bound diary waited in a shrine that had been prepared decades before his birth. The journal's weathered pages contained the handwriting of the guardian who had preceded him, a man whose final entries revealed secrets that transformed everything. Kyle thought he knew about his place in a much larger war. The diary's author identified himself as Thomas Kale, the grandfather whose name the abandoned child had unknowingly inherited along with his guardian destiny. But the entries revealed that Thomas had not died protecting the valley alone, as tradition suggested. Instead, he had been part of a vast network of mystical protectors scattered across the globe, each defending similar sacred sites from the same corporate forces that now threatened the mountain sanctuary. River's behavior as Kyle read the shocking revelations confirmed the dog's awareness of truths that had been carefully hidden until this moment of greatest need. The transformation that had awakened Kyle's supernatural abilities had also unlocked access to knowledge that connected his struggle to battles being fought on every continent. Wherever ancient powers intersected with modern greed, the diary described other guardians, men and women chosen in childhood to protect mystical springs, sacred groves, and power centers that formed a network of spiritual energy spanning the entire planet. Each site faced similar threats from expeditions equipped with technology specifically designed to locate and exploit supernatural resources for commercial purposes. Thomas's final entries, written during the crisis that had cost him his life, detailed the systematic campaign being waged against all mystical sites by a consortium of corporations and government agencies that had learned to harvest supernatural energies for weapons, development and life extension technologies. The expedition currently threatening Kale's Valley was merely one tentacle of an organization that had been growing in power and sophistication for over a century. But the diary's most shocking revelation came in its description of other active guardians who continued to defend their assigned territories against the same enemies. Kyle was not alone in his struggle. Dozens of protectors remained active across the world, each fighting similar battles while maintaining the illusion of isolation that protected the network from complete discovery. River's enhanced consciousness allowed him to process the diary's information with supernatural speed, his reactions confirming details that stretched Kale's comprehension to its limits. The dog had known of the other guardians, had been part of a communication network that connected mystical protectors across vast distances through means that transcended normal understanding. The coordinates listed in Thomas's final entries revealed the locations of other threatened sites: a sacred lake in the Scottish Highlands, an ancient grove in the Amazon rainforest, a mystical spring beneath the streets of Prague. Each location faced expeditions similar to the one now operating in Kyle's Valley, their defenders struggling against forces that possessed technology specifically designed to overcome supernatural protections. Most profound of all was the diary's description of the collective power that could be accessed when multiple guardians coordinated their efforts. The mystical energies that each protected individually could be linked across continents to create defenses that no earthly force could penetrate, but only if the guardians could establish communication and trust before their individual sites were compromised. River's sudden alertness drew Kale's attention. to sounds that suggested their hidden refuge had been discovered by expedition scouts. But as they prepared to abandon the shrine, the diary's final pages revealed emergency protocols that Thomas had established for exactly this situation, ways to contact other guardians. When the network faced its greatest threat, the leather journal contained more than just historical records. It held communication codes and mystical techniques that would allow Kale to reach across the globe to guardians who face similar crises. The isolation that had defined his entire existence was revealed as a protective illusion that could be set aside when survival required collective action. As expedition forces closed in on their location, Kale realized that his grandfather's sacrifice had not been in vain if it could inspire the coordination that might save all the sacred sites from systematic destruction. The diary's revelations transformed his desperate struggle from hopeless resistance into the opening phase of a global conflict between ancient wisdom and modern exploitation. River's guidance through escape routes that seemed to materialize just when needed confirmed the dog's connection to supernatural networks that extended far beyond the valley's borders. Their partnership was part of a larger alliance that connected mystical beings across species and continents in defense of powers that predated human civilization. The weight of inherited responsibility multiplied beyond anything Kale had imagined as he understood that his actions in the coming confrontation would influence the fate of guardians and sacred sites throughout the world. The diary's final entry, written in Thomas's dying hand, carried a message that burned itself into Kale's consciousness with the force of a sacred trust. The network endures. Find the others. Complete what I began. The final preparations for battle began with a pilgrimage to the 4 cardinal points of the valley, where Kale discovered the elemental stones that would amplify his guardian powers to their maximum potential. River's supernatural guidance led them through a precise sequence of locations where ancient guardians had embedded crystalline formations that channeled the fundamental forces of earth, air, fire, and water into a unified defensive network. The first stone lay buried beneath the roots of an enormous pine tree that had stood sentinel over the valley's northern approach for over 1,000 years. As Kale's hands closed around the earth-touched crystal, warmth spread through his body that carried the patient strength of mountains and the enduring power of stone foundations that had weathered countless storms. River's enhanced senses detected the harmonic resonance that began building as soon as the earth stone was awakened by Kale's touch. The crystal's activation sent vibrations through the valley's underground structure that alerted every mystical defense to prepare for the coming confrontation. The airstone waited at the summit of the highest peak within the valley's borders, where winds from all directions converged in patterns that had guided weather systems since the Ice Age. The climb to reach it tested Kale's transformed physical capabilities, while River demonstrated flight abilities that revealed the true extent of his mystical evolution. As the airstone joined its power to the earth crystal already in Kale's possession, the atmosphere itself began responding to his presence. Clouds gathered according to his intentions, while wind patterns shifted to create aerial defenses that would confuse and disorient any aircraft the expedition might deploy against them. The firestone blazed with inner light from its resting place in a cave where natural gas seepages had maintained eternal flames for millennia. Its heat was not merely thermal, but spiritual, carrying the transformative power that could purify corruption and burn away the technological pollution that threatened the valley's natural harmony. River's approach to the firestone required extreme caution, the mystical flames responding to the dog's presence with recognition that bordered on worship. As Kyle claimed the third elemental crystal, the very air around them shimmered with energies that would prove devastating to electronic equipment and foreign technologies. The water stone rested at the bottom of the sacred spring itself, where it had served as the heart of the mystical energies that granted the pool its miraculous properties. Retrieving it required Kale to dive deeper into the enchanted waters than he had ever ventured, his guardian medallion providing protection against pressures that would have crushed an ordinary human. As his fingers closed around the final crystal, the spring's power flowed through him with intensity that temporarily overwhelmed his enhanced senses. Through the waterstone's connection, he could feel every stream, every hidden pool, every underground channel that carried the valley's life-giving essence to its farthest reaches. River's transformation reached its culmination as all four elemental stones came together in Kale's possession. The dog's physical form now blazed with supernatural radiance that marked him as a being of pure mystical energy constrained within living flesh only by choice and necessity. The convergence of elemental powers triggered responses throughout the valley that announced the Guardian's readiness to defend his sanctuary with forces that predated human civilization. Ancient trees straightened their trunks and spread their branches to create natural barriers along invasion routes. Underground streams altered their courses to flood areas where heavy machinery might attempt to establish positions, but the stone's greatest gift was the connection they established to guardian networks across the globe. Through their combined power, Kale could sense other protectors responding to his call from sacred sites on distant continents. The mystical energy that flowed between the crystals carried messages of support and shared power that transformed his solitary struggle into coordinated resistance. River's telepathic abilities now extended far beyond their immediate partnership to encompass communication with mystical beings defending other sanctuaries. The network that his grandfather's diary had described was real and active, responding to the crisis in the mountain valley with resources that spanned the entire planet. The expedition's final approach had begun while Kyle gathered the elemental stones, their heavy machinery carving roads through previously untouched wilderness with complete disregard for the spiritual significance of what they were destroying. But their progress was now monitored by supernatural senses that could track every movement and anticipate every tactical decision. As night fell over the valley, Kyle stood at the heart of his transformed sanctuary with the four elemental stones blazing in response to his guardian medallion's proximity. River at his side radiated power that connected them to mystical allies across the world, while around them the very landscape prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether ancient wisdom could triumph over modern greed. The stones pulsed with rhythms that matched his heartbeat as forces beyond human understanding gathered for a battle that would echo through both the physical and spiritual realms. The final confrontation erupted at dawn, when the expedition's forces reached the sacred grove surrounding the mystical spring, only to discover that their carefully planned assault had walked directly into a trap prepared by powers they had never imagined possible. At the center of the ancient pool, where the spring's source emerged from the mountain's deepest heart, a massive crystal formation pulsed with energy that transformed the entire battlefield into a nexus between the physical and spiritual worlds. The heart of the mountain blazed with internal fire as Kale channeled the combined power of the four elemental stones through his guardian medallion, creating defenses that turned the expedition's sophisticated technology against itself. Electronic equipment failed in cascading waves as mystical energies overloaded circuits designed for a purely material world, leaving the invaders blind and deaf in a landscape that responded to supernatural commands. River's transformed presence served as the focal point for coordination between Kale's conscious will and the valley's autonomous defenses. The dog's blazing form moved through the battlefield like liquid light, his supernatural speed allowing him to appear wherever the mystical forces needed direction or amplification. The expedition leader's crystal pendant provided her only protection against the overwhelming spiritual energies that filled the grove. But even its sophisticated design proved inadequate against forces that had been building for millennia. As her technological advantages evaporated one by one, she found herself facing an enemy that operated according to rules her scientific training had never prepared her to understand. Kyle's connection to the heart of the mountain allowed him to perceive the battle from perspectives that transcended normal human awareness. Through the crystal's vast consciousness, he could see the expedition's forces struggling against defenses that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Their weapons useless against enemies that could shift between material and spiritual existence at will. The valley's wildlife emerged from hiding to join the defense of their sanctuary, but their participation transcended normal animal behavior. Bears moved with tactical precision that suggested military training, while birds coordinated aerial surveillance patterns that fed information directly to Kyle's enhanced awareness through River's telepathic network underground. Streams responded to the heart of the mountain's call by altering their courses to flood equipment caches and vehicle positions, while ancient trees bent their massive trunks to block escape routes and create natural barriers that channeled the expedition's movements into carefully prepared kill zones. The corporate forces' attempt to retreat foundered when they discovered that the mystical energies protecting the valley had created spatial distortions that made navigation impossible. Roads they had carved through the wilderness now led in circles, while GPS systems provided readings that contradicted observable reality. River's supernatural abilities reached their peak as he manifested multiple forms simultaneously, appearing as both the loyal dog Kale had always known and as a being of pure mystical energy that could communicate directly with the expedition's leader through means that bypassed language entirely. The confrontation's turning point came when the expedition leader's pendant began resonating with the heart of the mountain in ways that revealed her true connection to the forces she had been trying to exploit. The crystal formation's vast intelligence recognized her artifact as a fragment of its own essence, stolen from another sacred site during a previous corporate raid. As understanding dawned, the expedition leader's resistance crumbled under the weight of revelation about what her organization had been destroying in their quest for supernatural resources. The heart of the mountain's memories flowed through her pendant, showing her visions of sacred sites across the globe that had been violated and depleted by expeditions identical to her own. Kyle's mastery of the elemental stones allowed him to extend an offer of redemption rather than destruction to the corporate forces that had violated his sanctuary. The mystical energies that could have annihilated them instead offered transformation, the chance to become protectors rather than exploiters of the supernatural heritage they had been hired to harvest. The Bao expedition's scientific team found their understanding of reality fundamentally altered as the heart of the mountain shared knowledge that revealed the true interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Their instruments, designed to measure and exploit, were transformed into tools for understanding and preservation. River's final transformation united his individual consciousness with the vast network of mystical beings that protected sacred sites across the world, his loyalty to Kyle expanding into service to the global community of guardians and their sanctuaries. As the immediate threat dissolved into alliance, the heart of the mountain's influence spread beyond the valley's borders to strengthen every guardian network on the planet. The confrontation that had threatened to destroy one sacred site instead became the catalyst for uniting all mystical protectors in a defensive coalition that would preserve ancient wisdom for future generations. The crystal formation's pulsing rhythm settled into harmonies that spoke of victory achieved not through destruction, but through the transformation of enemies into allies. ensuring that the valley's mystical heritage would endure under protection that now spanned both the corporate and spiritual worlds. 3 months after the confrontation that had transformed enemies into allies, Kale knelt beside the sacred spring to plant a seedling that embodied everything his valley had taught him about renewal and hope. The small plant in his hands grew only in soil, nourished by the mystical waters, its delicate leaves shimmering with the same inner light that pulsed within the heart of the mountain. River watched from nearby, his physical form once again resembling the loyal dog who had shared 20 years of simple wilderness life, though his eyes retained depths that spoke of supernatural wisdom and global connections that would never fade. Their partnership had evolved beyond anything Kale could have imagined, strengthened by trials that had revealed the true meaning of guardianship. The expedition's former leader, now serving as liaison between the corporate world and the Guardian network, approached with reports from sacred sites across the globe. Her transformation from exploiter to protector had inspired similar conversions throughout the organization that had once threatened mystical sanctuaries worldwide, as Kale settled the seedling into earth that had been blessed by the spring's eternal flow. He reflected on how completely his understanding of his place in the world had changed. The abandoned child who had known only survival and solitude had become the focal point of a global alliance dedicated to preserving ancient wisdom for future generations. The valley itself bore witness to the positive changes that had emerged from apparent catastrophe. Areas damaged by the expedition's initial intrusion showed signs of supernatural healing, with vegetation growing more vibrantly than ever before and wildlife returning in numbers that exceeded historical populations. River's enhanced connection to Guardian networks provided regular updates on the success of similar transformations at other threatened sites. The mystical springs in Scotland ran clearer than they had in centuries, while the Amazon Grove had expanded its protective influence to encompass vast areas of rainforest previously vulnerable to exploitation. The seedling's roots spread quickly in the enriched soil, drawing nourishment from waters that carried the concentrated essence of the mountain's power. Its growth would serve as a living symbol of the renewal that was possible when ancient wisdom guided modern capabilities toward preservation rather than destruction. Kyle's guardian medallion pulsed with warmth as he completed the planting ritual, its bronze surface reflecting light that seemed to come from sources beyond the physical sun. The artifact had become so integrated with his identity that he could barely remember what life had felt like before accepting the responsibility it represented. The former expedition scientists worked nearby, their research now focused on understanding and protecting the mystical properties they had once sought to exploit. Their instruments, transformed by exposure to supernatural energies, provided insights that bridged the gap between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. As evening approached, River's telepathic communication carried messages of gratitude from guardians on every continent, their collective relief and joy flowing through networks that connected sacred sites across vast distances. The unity forged in crisis had created defensive capabilities that would preserve mystical sanctuaries for generations yet to come. The new growth seedling stretched its first leaves toward stars that seemed to shine more brightly than ever before, as if the cosmos itself celebrated the victory of preservation over exploitation. Its presence promised that the valley's healing influence would continue expanding, touching lives and landscapes far beyond the mountain borders. Kale stood beside the spring as darkness settled over his transformed world. River at his side, and the weight of global responsibility balanced by the support of allies who shared his commitment to protecting the ancient forces that sustained all life. The seedling's gentle glow joined the greater light that emanated from the heart of the mountain, creating illumination that would guide future guardians toward wisdom earned through courage, sacrifice, and the understanding that true strength came from unity rather than isolation. the peaceful sounds of his nocturnal valley. Surrounded them, owl calls and stream murmurs and the whisper of wind through leaves that sang of harmony restored and sanctuary, preserved for all who would come after.